And we're live. Good morning and welcome to Friday morning's Coffee, Buses and Politics. It's a very wet one this morning. I don't know what it's like where you are, but at the moment I think St Neots is on the verge of flooding. But it's normally we're quite tired on a Friday morning because it's like 7:30 or 7:40 by the time we get started. But I think David and Alex have had a particularly hard week because you've been living it up at the Labour Party conference in Brighton. How was that, guys?
It was in Liverpool. Like
Was
I
it
actually,
Liverpool? I
I
thought it was
actually
in Brighton, so
yeah.
that shows you how much attention I've been paying to it.
Well,
So
that's
how was Liverpool then?
Yes, it was in Liverpool. It's been for a couple of years, and I think for a couple of more years because they plan to do the next 5 years or so at
Yeah.
Liverpool. So yeah, I actually do like Liverpool as a city. I have some friends living there, so in terms of catching up with some friends, it's always good to be in Liverpool. But yes, I've been for the full conference. I've been from Saturday until the conference ended. Literally, when it actually ended on Wednesday, because I was also at the Migrant Democracy Project stall, which is the organization I co-founded. So I was there until the very end, seeing how conference looks like when all the stalls are taken down and you have that empty hall.
It's
So
always a
I've
bit
seen
sad
it.
at the end, isn't it? When everybody's packing up and going home.
Yes, exactly. So it was quite interesting for me because I've been to Labour conference since 2017, I think, the first one I've been to, and I've always been mostly in a work capacity. So back then in 2017, I was lobbying on citizens' rights in the Brexit negotiations, and then I was doing like lots of like speeches and different meetings on migration and refugee rights in general. So I think this year I tried to split my time between like work related and like what is actually useful for me as a county councillor to attend. So I attend lots of fringe events and panels around things that I work on in the county council. So there are lots of events on sand provision as one of the very big issues facing our councils, of course, like around education, schools. I attend a few like on vocational education and bridging skills gaps in the UK, and a few, unsurprisingly, on transport, buses, but also trains as well. So it was quite good. It was, I think, the busiest program of events outside the main conference program, because obviously Labour is in government, so it was quite expected. There's a lot more to choose from. I'm not sure if it's useful, David, given that I think have you been in the delegate in the past, to explain what goes on at conference and how it's structured, because some of our colleagues, of course, who are delegates to conference, which we weren't, are sitting in the conference hall and listening to all the various speeches that are broadcasted on TV as well and on social media memes. Whereas for me, it was mainly being outside the conference hall, apart from the leader's speech, where I got a seat at the leader's speech. It was the only time I was actually in the conference hall. Other than that, I was outside in various events, receptions, as well as the stall in the exhibition center.
Yeah, so I mean, I wasn't a delegate this year, but I have been a couple of times in the past. The conference sets what if you like, the direction of the party in some way, or the rules are that the manifesto should take due account of what's passed at conference, and obviously sometimes it's politically more important because it gives an indication of what the party want. So you have reports from a thing called the National Policy Forum. So on what the policy should be on, basically the whole gamut of policy. Those reports are reasonably detailed. And they're generally presented, along with a sort of speech from the minister, well, now minister, previously shadow minister responsible. You also have the motions that people can, CLPs, constituency Labour parties, trade unions, and socialist societies can submit. So that's the bulk of it. Then you have a few particularly big set piece speeches, the leader and Rachel Reeves and so on. You've then got the fringe, which is all of the events that are put on, where you have events on just about everything under the sun. from small, relatively small panels on a niche area of policy to speeches from it'll be politicians or business people or charity leaders, or discussions on a particular policy area. There's receptions and so on. And then there's an exhibition with, where lots of different organizations have stands where they're trying to influence the party in some way. I think that's most of what it is.
So I didn't understand. I hadn't understood until this conversation the difference between delegates and attendees. So do you have to be are delegates nominated by their local parties to go and sit in the policy making part of the conference? Yeah,
basically. So when I went as a delegate, or when I've been, the couple of occasions I've been as a delegate, Huntingdon Constituency Labour Party has said, yeah, right, you're our delegate, or in the numbers you have change depending on how many members you've got and so on. So at the moment, I think we've only got one. Well, we've only got one delegate because we're a relatively small constituency Labour Party. Bigger ones will have sort of 3 or 4 if they're that much bigger. You also get delegates nominated by trade unions, affiliated trade unions, and then what are called socialist societies. So the socialist societies are things like CERA, which I think which is the Environmental Campaign, or the Fabian Society. I'm trying to remember the whole list of socialist societies. They get a few, but most of the CLPs and unions. So Disability Labour, Christians on the Left, Jewish Labour Movement, Labour Business.
Is there agnostics on the left organisation?
Yeah.
I mean, you could set one up, if you wanted.
The problem with that is I only sort of conform to one part of that, not the other part. So
you're on. So that's how basically how it works. And when you go as a delegate, you get given a little booklet with sort of numbers on it, from 1 to whatever. And so most votes they do by people raising their hands. But if it's close, you might have a card vote where you sort of pull out. So you've got green and red, I think it is, on vote number 1 or vote number 2 all the way through, and you pull out the appropriate ticket, and people come around with ballot boxes, and that's how you vote.
It's far too complicated.
So Martin, obviously you're not a member of the Conservative Party at the moment, and we're going to talk a bit about next week's conference for the Conservatives. But having been to Conservative Party conferences in the past, is it very different? Do you have the same delegate system at Conservative Party conferences?
Yeah. Basically, with the Conservative Party, if you're a Conservative Party member, you can go to a conference, but it depends what sort of member you are. There's no sort of differentiation in that respect. The Conservative Party have what's called the convention on the day before conference, which is where basically the association chairman turn up and they have conversations with, and they have presentations, and technically that's where they have votes, but it's pretty closed, to be honest. But the reality about the Conservative Party conference, it's much, much more stage managed. And that's why the headlines from the Conservative Party conference and the controversy with the Labour Party conference, the controversy, a lot of it comes out of the votes that are held. So this year, it's the one about winter fuel allowance. Whereas with the Conservative Party conference, what they tend to do is drag stuff out of the fringe. And that's how they do it. The Conservative Party conference has a massive, massive fringe. And, that's where the controversy is. And that's where the interest is within the party as well. That's where you really find out what's going on. And one of the things that's interesting for me is I've always found with party conferences, and I don't know if the Labour Party is the same, that sometimes the one that the media throw across is not the one that you experience down on the ground. And partly because the media is picking up on the controversy and heightening it. And on the ground, you're talking about that stuff, but you're talking about the wider issues as well, and the political issues. And I suspect that's very similar to the Labour Party conference as well. That part of it.
No, it's interesting, like on what like goes like viral on Twitter. So like I think it was the first time I was actually in the hall watching the leader's speech, because this year you need to have a ticket to it. Obviously, if you're MP, mayor, and so on, you are in the front rows, but everyone else had a ticket for it. Whereas
which row were you in, Alex? ZZ.
no, I was like quite at the back, but like I have to say, like when I got out and like opened Twitter, and the first thing was like memes around sausages, right? Because I was sat at the back, and then the moment that like Keir Starmer spoke, you hear like when he started speaking around in general, like about foreign policy, and like he started mentioning Gaza, people like started applauding. So I didn't even hear like how he misspoke, because I just heard like the applause around me on that. And when I got out, I was like, oh my god, like he actually misspoke. And then it's all over social media. I think you would have a different experience when you're listening obviously on TV or on a screen, because you hear what the microphone picks up and hear his voice very clearly, whereas in the hall, especially at the back, especially in the moments where people like are either heckling or applauding, you kind of hear what's around you, and it's quite difficult to hear exactly every single word, or whether it's a mistake or not. So yeah, that's like speaks to one of the things, like what you experience in the hall like might be a bit different to what people focus on if you're listening through like a live stream, for example.
Was there any heckling of his speech?
There were, I think, a couple, is that right? A couple of people who are protesting who actually got quite a bit of coverage, one in Rachel Reeves' speech and one during the leader's speech, who stood up in the middle of the speech and started saying something on Gaza. So yes,
were they escorted out? Or?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, it does not, as you remember last year was the whole, one of the key media headlines was around the glitter. And last year, I have to say, I was watching on a screen last year in this kind of like hall where people who are not in the main hall like watch the speech. And that is something that I actually found quite shocking, not in the sense whether what they said was right or wrong, or whether there was freedom of speech to say that, is the fact that like how can you be the leader of the opposition and have someone get so close to you on the stage and not have security stop the person on time if you're in that position. But this year, like nothing happened in that sense. There was someone who was quite far back in the hall who said something during the speech, and they were escorted out of the conference.
I was in the hall last year. When I mean, it was really quite shocking, because it took people it takes a moment to realize what's going on, and it's like it wasn't clear what had happened. I mean, I think this year they had both Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer clearly had pre-prepared lines on how to deal with hecklers and whatever. I mean, they were I think they were pretty clearly pre-prepped lines.
So how did you think?
Go on, Stephen. It makes sense, that stuff. It's going to happen nowadays, especially I think within the Labour Party. It does happen within the Conservative Party conference, but not very often. But I think it makes sense to be as prepped as you can for it.
Yeah. So the Labour Party is quite a broad church these days, isn't it? Did you feel there was a display of unity for your leadership at the conference, or was it more split than that, would you say? Because quite often on social media you do see factions of the party being quite critical of your leadership choices. How did it feel at the conference?
I actually think, like, in terms of the speech and like after coming out of the speech, was, yes, people can argue it can be like heavier on policy or announcements, but I think overall it was like quite a pragmatic speech, and like quite like it appeals to various people across the party. I think it's very difficult because I've been when I've been attending over the last 7 or 8 years, I've always attended previously in a like kind of lobbying or influencing capacity, and you listen to the speech and like, oh damn, he didn't mention that particular issue I was like lobbying for in terms of policy. And I think like a lot of people are like that. It's like, well, but I didn't mention this or that. The reality is the speech has to be something that's that's uniting, something that appeals like across some divides, and something that is like a bit pragmatic and not like, you can't cover like every single, policy area or every single ask from every single group there. So of course, when you get out and speak to some colleagues who are campaigning on that or that, they're like, well, he didn't mention anything about X or Y or whatever issue they're campaigning for. It's exactly how I felt when I attended in like an organizational capacity, or like in terms of like, specifically influencing on a particular policy area. And of course, they don't mention exactly what you want. And you think like, oh, what's the point of this? But I think now, looking from the perspective as, like someone being like, his first speech at conference as prime minister, I think it was like good, overall, in terms of people coming out of it were like, yeah, it might not be like exactly what I want to hear in terms of this policy detail, but overall the framing was correct in terms of what we need to do. He had some good things, like in terms of like, that I really agreed in terms of like mentioning, like highlighting the role of like, education, and like this was very interesting in the fringes as well. There are a lot of fringes around vocational education and like skills shortages, and I kind of like, bridging that skills gap. So there's a lot of focus around that. I think like his bit around housing, around prioritizing, in terms of house building, young caregivers, young people, veterans, and so on. Like also good. It attracted a lot of applause, and people were very happy in the hall about that, as well as even like I have to say, someone who campaigned on migrants' rights and migration issues for a long time, I think the migration bit was also framed correctly. It was basically saying like, well, we don't have, blaming individual people or blaming migrants is toxic. We shouldn't do that, but we should think about, very serious about the economics of it, and like how, if we want to, or whether you agree or not, you need to reduce immigration. People have different views, but he was basically making the point that you can't like control migration and numbers if you have like complete like free market access, because at the end of the day you will like have all of your businesses and companies saying we need more people in X and Y, which is exactly what happens now. And if you don't have like more like kind of an industrial strategy or a plan to build skills in the country, like you want, it's an obvious thing for me, but like you obviously won't be able to fill in the gaps only by British workers. So it was like, for me, it was like, okay, that is an obvious idea. But like some of my colleagues who were like next to me and around me, they're like, wow, someone mentioned this. I'm like, yes, it is obvious. Like you can't like fill in some of the skills gaps without significant training and investment. I mean, it's not like a genius idea, but it was like, framed in an interesting way. It wasn't before, because usually lots of the labor speeches and leaders like framed it as like a more of a from a human rights perspective rather than like a more economic and skills perspective. So it was interesting.
How did you feel walking out of the conference hall after Keir Starmer's speech, David? Were you buzzed?
Well, I actually watched it on the train because I was already on the way home. So
how did you feel on the train, where in between the internet kind of freezes?
So, I thought the speech was fine. But he Tony Blair, he isn't. There were, people mentioned the sausages thing. There are a few other minor flubs and so on. The content I thought actually for the most part was pretty good. There's a lot there I liked. I think for the most part it was good. There are a couple of announcements, which were on sort of veterans housing and so on, which were welcome. I felt with that speech, what mattered is that it was fine. I don't think it sets the world afire. I don't think people are going to remember it for long. Was there anything big and surprising in there? I don't think so. Almost. I think that the sausages thing. So for people to say, instead of release the hostages, he said release the sausages, and you do wonder if the Greggs PR person or whoever does the Greggs Twitter account was suddenly very happy. Release the sausages.
You're getting freebies from Greggs. Is that what it is?
Yeah. Maybe we should ask them if they want to sponsor this show. The almost that helped because it kept that's what people focused on. People were like, oh, he said sausages instead of some of the more substantial stuff. So I mean, I think what's good, in terms of speeches that are going to matter, it's actually the budget when that comes round. Is going to be, and there wasn't much in there. There was like, oh, eventually things will improve. Great. I mean, I could have told you he was going to say that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other, one of the criticisms in general, and I remember this from the times of Corbyn as well, although Corbyn, had a very different speaking style. But I remember people even saying in the Corbyn leadership times, like, oh, he wasn't inspiring enough, or he needs to be more inspiring. And this kind of trend carried on, when Starmer was leader, saying well, he's even less inspiring or engaging. We need to have more inspiring speeches. And one of the things I actually liked in Keir Starmer's speech is he was very straightforward about well, I'm not here to give easy answers. I'm here to actually offer quite a pragmatic approach to politics. And I thought that's exactly what I don't really agree with. For me, being in a party and I listen to their speech, I don't want a motivational speech, because I can go to a motivational coach for that. I don't need a kind of a business speech where it's you leave and you're super energized and you're yes, I can do this, I can get rich quickly and feel super inspired. I want someone who says, look, the situation is like this is how I think I want to address this, and those are the policies that will help me towards this. I don't want another celebrity, prime minister.
I sort of agree with that, Alex, but my problem looking from the outside in with the party conference is this is a party of government now, and the Labour Party are a party of government, and what there wasn't was any substance about what. And my big concern before the election about Keir Starmer was people voted Labour because they didn't want the Conservatives, not because they liked Keir Starmer. Yeah. And with the issues that he's faced early on in his leadership over, the free gear Keir stuff and all that, some of that lack of his personal popularity is coming to bite, and it's starting to really impact. And the Labour Party need to provide some meat very, very quickly in government about what they're going to do, not just the rhetoric about what they intend to do. And my concern about the conference was there's not enough of that. And actually, during the conference, there was an announcement that, as an example, the publication of the revised national public, the NPPF, I forgot what it exactly stands for, which is government's housing policy and planning policy, has been delayed until the new year because of the weight of numbers of responses. Now, if they weren't expecting loads and loads of responses to the NPPF consultation, that is something in itself. But very, very quickly, the Labour Party need to start knitting something together that has some substance to it, because otherwise I think they're going to be in trouble very early.
Yeah, I mean,
I kind of agree as well. On social media, this government's not getting any slack at all, is it? And it's very different. I mean, there was no social media, I guess, during the last Labour government or in the early days of it. But this time round, there's no slack, and nobody's cut. And I think lots of people are immediately forgiving the previous government, the previous administration, for all of the things they did and putting the focus straight on Labour. Yeah, part of that is, I think, a lack of trust of politicians in general. But yeah, it's been quite a hard start, I think, from the outside.
Yeah, I think in a way I kind of think similarly to what we're discussing around councils and what people see in what councils do. And Stephen saying, if you sort out weeds and potholes, most people are happy. I think that's exactly kind of my perspective with now, now with the new government. I think you have to focus on things that everyone feels. And that's why one of the reasons why the winter fuel payment has been so controversial, perhaps more than they expected. You need to sort out the housing issues, which links into planning and how important it is to be rolled out quickly, the planning reforms. So the housing and the cost of energy, and that's why the GB energy plans come into play, but in a longer term perspective. So I think for me the question is, what can you do quicker? What can you do in the short term to address those big issues around?
I agree that's the point, is about short-term wins. There is stuff about what they want to do in the long term. There's no meat about how they're going to do it. So Wes Streeton made some comments about sorting out public services and the need to sort out public services, and he's right. Our public services aren't great, and actually, this is why I'm a fan of Sue Gray being in the position she's in, because she understands the civil service and she knows what she needs to do. I'm going to say it this way as an ex-civil servant, but to break the civil service so you can rebuild it, because that to me is what's needed. But there's no meat to how that's going to happen. I know the Sue Gray thing is devolution, and a big part of it, and seems to be about taking a look at not necessarily what can be devolved, but what government hasn't done well in the past and should be devolved. And I'm not against that approach, but it needs somebody who understands the inside and the inner workings of the civil service to do it. But it also needs some leadership about that, and that it just seems to be missing at the moment. It's that bit. And it might be, you know my view. I think the Labour Party will go in 3 years for the next general election. But somewhere between now and those 3 or 4 years, whenever it is, they've got to show some progress. Not just to say we're going to sort the long-term issues out, because some of them will be 10 years.
Yeah.
What was the general feeling amongst delegates, like outside the conference hall? Was it a celebratory conference because you just had a massive election victory just a few months ago? Did you get that sense of things can only get better kind of celebration, or was it more, getting down to work? What was the atmosphere like?
I mean, I think strangely it was quite uncertain. It wasn't celebratory, and I think there was almost a sort of feeling of what do we do? I mean, I think I take the point that Martin makes, and I do agree with it. But we have only been in government for 11 weeks.
But you were in opposition for 14, and that's a time when you could have put some of this substance and meat together, so you could have announced it quickly in government.
Yeah. Well, yes. I mean, I mean, things changed quite a lot over those 14 years, and I take the point. But what on a lot of things, it felt like, well, we're not, this policy is coming out, but it's not been fully developed yet. And there was quite a lot of stuff that I think that has happened, sort of fairly quickly. The onshore wind, the removal of the onshore wind ban, for instance, I think is a big one, and some of the other things around sort of solar plants and that sort of thing. But it's also getting to grips with the reality of being in government, because we don't have that many people who have been ministers before. But yeah. on this was in terms of like the events I was at, it was a little bit okay. Labour's in government, and then here's in sort of all of the different ones I went to. Now here's a huge list of problems that the country faces that Labour's now got to deal with, and it was like, yay, we've won. And like some of the speeches, it was like, oh, I'm delighted to introduce the first Labour Secretary of State for 14 years. Now here's the huge amount of things on your in tray. What are you going to do about planning reform? Because you've got that sort of thing. Or what are you going to do about nuclear power? And sort of across the whole piece. I mean,
the issue. Some of the issues. So I'm just pushing on this because I think it's important. But I'll give you an example. Solar and wind. I've dealt with solar farms and I've dealt with wind turbines in the past, and the issue I know is government opening the door for more solar and wind. It's a good thing. From my perspective, I think it's a good thing. But there's a reality, which is that with solar power and with wind power, you're still facing with the same planning system to get them through and to get them approved as you are for housing, for the most, unless they're NSIP projects, when in some ways they're even worse because they take forever. And so, you've still got the fundamentals underneath that policy that need fixing and sorting quickly. And if Labour want to deliver, what is it, 3 million houses over 5 years? If they want to deliver that, they've got to get on and shift. That's the issue.
Yeah, I mean, so there are some things where they have moved quickly, like, you know, it was just a policy change to allow onshore wind again. That's, you know, that has happened quickly.
No, I don't think that's a great thing.
Now on the planning system, you know, they started the process. I mean, planning is firstly, it's one you want to get right. It's not one you want to have to keep going back to, but also it is so complicated and so much needs doing. I mean, the last MPF change for Michael Gove wasn't that long ago. I think on you know, like, yes, we need to get going with things, but I think we are sort of as you know.
The last MPPF change that Michael Gove did was a bit of tokenism as well. I mean, Michael Gove was sat in the middle of seeing what needed to be done and listening to the Conservative right, and the two were completely different things. And the last MPPF was trying to create the balance in the middle of there. But there are things they can do. As an example, the planning inspectorate and the amount of time it takes for a planning application to go through the appeal process. Because it does nobody any good. Landowners are basically invested in sites, and are paying interest basically on the amount of money they're invested in a lot of those sites. And if you're talking about a year plus for an application to go through that appeals process, you know, that costs. And yes, in some cases they can recoup costs if councils have been unreasonable, but you can invest in people in pins to start turning round appeals very quickly, very early. And that does two things. Not only does it speed the system up, which is a good thing, the other thing is it makes those appeal decisions closer to, in terms of time, to the decisions that the council have made to overturn that application, or to refuse an application. And that closeness means that it's more in people's memory when the appeals are decided. And politically, that's important.
And I agree with all of that, but what is it that Labour should have done on that they haven't done so far?
Well, investment in pins is the answer, and also something that Greg Clark tried to do, which is lay the law down a little bit with pins, to say the amount of timescale, the timescale it's taking to turn this around is too long. And you must up your game. And there are plenty of experienced retired planners that would quite happily do pins work as a one-off that you could invest in to start doing this.
So I don't think that was ever going to happen in, you know, with everything else going on in 11 weeks. I just don't. I think the other thing is I think the points you make are entirely fair, entirely reasonable. Obviously, you know more about the planning system than I do, but we're also going through and sort of sorting out the budget and all the rest of it.
I agree.
You know, I think, there I think there is a practical thing here that we came in, had the summer. You know, there's things are moving, and it is taking time to sort of get grip of everything.
And I've given you a hard time, and I apologize.
That's all right.
But there is a reality, which is the long-term need to sort out public services. I think is really, really important, and it's right that government focus on it and set expectations that some of this is going to take 10 years. Absolutely, and I actually applaud that, because too much government has been short-termism. But having said that, and being a total hypocrite, there isn't enough short-termism in the current government.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, yeah, I think I get where you're coming with that, and I think that there is something. So let's put it like this: the honeymoon is gone.
Yeah,
and I think if we're not careful, there's going to be a narrative that develops about, oh, nothing happening, everything's the same, it's all rubbish. Now, and then things will improve, hopefully, over the next few years. But it's going to take time for that to happen. That's not going to be quick. And if there aren't some quick wins that people see, that will, that will set a narrative that will be a problem. I mean, I think there's some stuff that will help. Sort of the getting rid of no fault evictions and so on, I think will help. The point is that will help. For some people that will be a really big deal. Not everyone rents. I mean, it sounds ridiculous, but that you'll know someone who rents or whatever. But equally, there's quite a lot of people it just won't touch, and that's that's an issue as well.
The crux of it to me is what you said earlier on, that the most important speech this year is going to be Rachel Reeves's budget, and that has got to provide. And I think the Labour part, the conference and the preamble to the conference, I think set this out, which is that has got to provide. It's got to provide some sunlight. It is the reality for people, and where that comes from, I don't know. I suspect. Again, the debate that's happening, which is about changing some of the fiscal rules, which I'm not totally averse to. I think we need to separate the difference between day-to-day spending and long-term investment within how we budget, and I think that's what's being touted. I think that's right. There is a push for tax increment funding again coming from Cambridgeshire. Which I hope the government listen to, because that will enable a lot of infrastructure, but it's still technically borrowing. But it's funding that will pay back, and so there are things she can do, I think. But I agree that I think Rachel Reeves's budget is probably the most important political event of the year.
Yeah,
aside from the general election.
We're just talking about financial things and early decisions. One of the big early decisions of this government was the winter fuel payments, and that was quite controversial at conference, wasn't it? Because I think there was a motion from Unite to reverse that, which I think succeeded, didn't it? I think members voted.
Yeah, I won't go into explaining the voting system and how it works. But yes, that was passed. Again, it's debate whether to what extent it will have the influence, because unlike other smaller parties, it's not exactly the case of whatever is voted conference becomes party policy, because it sits within this national policy framework as well as the manifesto. So it's not like a direct. You vote on something that directly becomes policy, although it is significant in the sense of if this vote happens on the conference floor, it does put pressure. If you remember in the past as well, the some previous Labour conferences when Brexit was a big issue, and how on the conference floor there were votes around that kind of contradicted the party policy at the time, and then the party still kept on with their policy on Brexit. It is debatable to what extent it will have an issue. However, I think, and I actually listened back to the speeches, that's something that I have, and I understand why, especially for new MPs, it's very difficult, despite of their personal views, not to stick with the policy of the time. However, for me, I think a lot of people are in this opinion that I have that am I against having an universal benefits? Yes, but am I also against the level to which it's set and the threshold which is set? Also, yes, right. And that is difficult, because I can't say I'm not against not having the universality of it, because yes, I also don't believe that someone who is a multimillionaire should get this, but I also believe that at the moment the under £12,000 it's too low as a threshold for that. The question is, which is always a difficult question, is how can you create a better way to means test the benefit? Is it, for example, through council tax bands? That's something that's interesting, but then again, council tax is not the best way to measure household income. You can't really it's very difficult to implement. Do I believe that the government will make a campaign for everyone who is entitled, even at this low threshold, to actually take up the benefits they're entitled to. Also, no, because I worked on like when the EU settlement scheme was, people had to apply to stay after Brexit, and not even then with like massive government investment in comms and like third sector organizations. Not even then you reach like it's not possible to reach 100% of a population is to make a change, right? So the question for me is there a better system to actually make sure that people who actually need it get it, which to me is not really clear. And I think I think that there must be a better way than it is at the moment.
So just two things. I'm quite cynical about all this stuff about campaigns to get people to claim it, because the more people claim, more people claim means tested benefits, the less the government benefit from what they've done around the winter fuel allowance. It wouldn't surprise me to see Rachel Reeves pull something out of her back pocket that doesn't reverse those cuts, but actually offers the money back in a different way.
Yeah,
that wouldn't surprise me. But I have a radical thought, which is how about what you do is you make performance payments to Citizens Advice Bureau for every person that they bring through that claims the benefit that claims the benefit that was entitled to the benefit and puts in a successful claim.
Yeah, or district councils as well, because the customer support team at the district council, if you sit with them, they'll go through every aspect of your life to try and find you what benefits you might be entitled for. We only pay council tax support, and housing benefit goes through district council, but in reality they'll try and sort you out, which is, I think, one of the fantastic services of district council, because it's those frontline people who touch people's lives, are the ones that can have an impact. I think that's a good suggestion.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a difficult debate as well, even on the conference floor, because you had speeches like obviously for and against the motion. And, like, it's very easy to say, like, well, to have someone as a speaker being like, well, I don't need it. And I'm in this category of person who doesn't need it. But no one is really making that argument. I think very few people are actually arguing for it to stay as a universal benefit. I think the whole argument is around at what level do you means test it? It's not like whether it should be universal or not. I mean, yes, there's some people who are debating, like, well, if you are against universality in winter fuel payment, why are you arguing for everyone to have free school meals, for example? So like that's an interesting different comparison, but I think it's a different issue, that one. Yeah,
I know for a fact that because so my wife was unemployed before she met me, and for the first few years of free school meals, she got free school meals. Trying to get yourself off that system, throughout the whole time the kids are at school is really difficult. And so, the whole of the benefit system doesn't work because it's not properly means tested.
Yeah.
And I guess getting the means testing sorted out and having a robust measure for doing it. The child benefit stuff was the same as well, kind of arbitrary distinctions on household income they can't track. Because you can't track, household income, you have to do it on one person's income. And all those things just don't work in the end.
And it's worth saying, in the past, I think some of this has been dealt with, but GDPR got in the way of that as well. I remember when we were trying a campaign to work with the district councils at the county council. I might have talked about this. We talked about this before, but what we were trying to do was identify those people who are most likely and it was all about free school meals. In fact, trying to identify those families that were entitled to free school meals to make sure they claimed it. And what we were trying to look at was get district councils and information around benefits from the district councils, so we could use that as a basis. And because it was a two-tier council, they weren't allowed to share the information. Whereas if you were a single-tier council, you could.
Yeah, I mean, that's
unitary. And it's those sort of things that, we need to look at where the system doesn't help and remove the barriers.
I mean, that's just mad, though, isn't it? If we've ended up in a situation like that, that's pretty poor.
Well, with GDPR, it doesn't even have to be real, does it? Because sometimes the threat of GDPR makes people act in really strange ways, and people don't understand it enough as well. That's difficult. So any last thoughts on the Labour Party conference before we move on to the next conference?
It was so much fun. We should do it all again next year.
Is there much drinking and revelry around the edges? I mean, is most of it done in bars and nightclubs in the evening? Martin's not in because that's the kind of guy he is. What time do you both get to bed? I want to know.
I mean, I think I'll say two things, because I think every person like has like a plan, like what they want to do at Labour Party conference. So like I have friends who go as delegates every year, and they really enjoy the debate and doing the speeches on the main conference hall, and like trying to influence the party from like within, you know, the delegate system. So like from the inside. There's some of my friends who are usually at the stall, like either a business or like a different lobbying group, who want to influence the party from the outside. And there are like people who just like go for a specific niche issue, and people who just go for the fun of the big speeches and taking photos with every single MP, which I think it's like really interesting. Like you see like MPs just walking out of a speech, and people are just following them. Like I thought, like it's one of those moments where I think like, thank God I wasn't elected, because I would absolutely hate that. I would hate to be like after a speech trying to go to the toilet, or like have a coffee, or relaxed 5 minutes before my next one, and have a queue of people trying to take a selfie.
Why are you even in politics? That's ridiculous.
All I want
I'm
to say,
terrified by it. Like I will actually need the staff being like, no photos now. She needs 5 minutes of silence.
all I want to say is this shows what a different person Alex is to me when she talks about the fun of the big speeches. That's not where the fun is in the party conference for me.
No, I'm saying that some people like that, like the leader speech. I mean, for me, it was interesting to be in the hall, but not my main highlight. I think, like, you know, from my perspective, I go to party conference apart from like my work, like non-council work, is firstly because I want to actually hear to ideas that I'm otherwise not exposed to. So I went, for example, and had chats with, you know, different campaign groups that don't necessarily agree with, just to know what they think, because I like doing that, like going to different stalls. I'm like, I probably will, you know, come with a subject I will disagree with whatever they're campaigning on, but actually having that conversation, exposing me to different ideas, and therefore develops my thinking around an issue. I went to like events, like, which is actually very interesting. David was in the same, around like, you know, blue labor events. I went to like all sorts of things. I don't go to the things that like I'll go there and listen to the same speech and agree and be like, oh, this is great. I want to go to things that like challenge my thinking, and like whether I still come out disagreeing with it, like that, you know, is like interesting for me. And then also I think it's about this where like kind of the more networking and drinking events come into place. It's actually about having conversations with people that you not really have in those big speeches or events as an equal, because often when you are in some of those receptions, you can actually approach an MP that you wouldn't really approach if you saw them on the street, or if you saw them after a panel, and you can have a chat with them like as a normal person, and not like really think that like, oh, you should write to them a formal letter to approach them. You can just say hello.
That I agree with, and you know, one of the things I remember, the last conference I went to was the one immediately prior to Boris getting appointed as Prime Minister. And I remember going to the Eastern Region reception, which and there were a number of Eastern Region MPs there, and I'm not going to mention any names, but what was quite interesting for me was the number of MPs that I have a lot of time for, who I know are real One Nationists, who, you know, and this is just getting from the conversations there, that were saying to me, we need to do the Boris thing, we need to get the Brexit thing done, and then we need to oust Boris. You know, and that's the tone that people, you know, that MPs had, that, you know, that Boris will be a short-term Prime Minister to, you know, in order to deal with the Brexit issue. And it was quite it was quite sort of enlightening to me, because those were MPs that basically politically think the same way as me, and so that part of it, getting that insight, and also as a councillor, the ability to go up and talk to your own MPs in a way that it's difficult to do sometimes locally. I know local MPs have meetings and stuff like that, but it's sometimes very hard to do. And conference, you can really get the chance to do that, and that's where the benefits do come.
I mean, I think on the, just because I don't really know how I feel about it, at the exhibition, I went to the stalls for the spoke to the people on the pro-assisted dying and the anti-assisted dying campaigns, which were on opposite sides of the hall, which was probably sensible. There was a thing a couple of years ago where Labour Friends of Israel and Labour Friends of Palestine were next to each other, which probably wasn't the best placement. This year, the Labour Friends of Israel were opposite the Morning Star, and I'm not sure if that's somebody with a sense of humour or not. I think probably one of the events I went to that I thought was interesting, or I particularly enjoyed. The Blue Labour one was very interesting, quite thought-provoking, but one where it was set up as a question: does the left tolerate conspiracy theories that it condemns on the right? And that was actually quite interesting because there people were doing, I think, a little bit of useful self-reflection about, okay, what, obviously with Labour we had, anti-Semitism, but more broadly about, are we setting the same standards for others, or are we keeping to the standards we set for others? Where do we have blind spots? That sort of thing. That's quite interesting. I mean, I did go to one with Lisa Nandy, which was lots of fun, and I do like Lisa Nandy. I'm not sure I learned anything. I did get to ask a question, which was, will you ban Twitter? And no was effectively the answer. But
I think,
yeah,
I think Twitter's banning itself these days, because I'm less interested in it. And that's my favorite social media platform. It's going the same way as all the others, I think, with just more content you don't subscribe to. But
I think the thing is like everyone does have a different conference. The other thing I did, I went to quite a lot of the training events that are put on by the Labour Party, and which I found, I found very useful. But those were, if you're a lobbyist or something, you'll have a completely different Labour Party conference, and
So next week, is it next week, Martin, is a Conservative Party conference? You're not going. You got any thoughts about that ahead of it?
A few. I think the Conservative Party conference next week is going to be all about for potential leadership candidates, and the whole focus is going to be interesting because there's going to be no focus whatsoever on the current leader of the Conservative Party, and whether he actually gives a conference speech or not, I don't know, because it'll be irrelevant. That's a reality, and it's all going to. There's two things, I think, but the main thing is going to be the four candidates putting themselves forward to the party membership. And I was at the party conference where a similar thing happened with David Davis and David Cameron, and in fact during that conference I changed my mind about who I was going to vote for, based on what I saw and heard from both candidates. But it is all going to be about those people, but I suspect there's also going to be a big focus on the fringe as well, and trying to find out, and trying to pick out the questions, the controversial questions, the questions that show the place that many on the Conservative right are at, and to show it in a bad light is the way I would put it. And that would be a lot of things around immigration, about Islam, trying to catch people out, and catch the Conservative Party out. I can see that being a feature of the conference, because that tends to be where the controversy is in the party conference anyway. And a lot of fringe meetings where they didn't 10 years ago tend to have cameras out. You've also got social media and phones and everything else. So there will be people there trying to do that. And I suspect that in the more relaxed moments, some of that is going to happen. But the main thing is about the candidates bringing themselves forward. I think all four of them have got conference speeches to do. So from that perspective, it'll be interesting. And for me, it's trying to get a sense of how far right the party is going to be post leadership. And I personally, I think it's going to be a right winger that wins. I've always said this, that this is the leader before the next one. The Conservative Party is going to change leader, is going to fail before it starts drifting in the direction it needs to go. And for me, as somebody that cannot bring himself to join the Conservative Party, but regrets leaving, if that makes sense. It's going to be really interesting. And I've had chats with senior people within the party. I had one about a week ago, and I said to him, are you enlightened by and enthused by the leadership campaign? And he laughed. And that's me talking to people that think like me, I suppose. But the Conservative Party, the reality is, the Conservative Party is not electorally is not going to succeed electorally until it starts drifting back to the centre ground. But the party membership at the moment, I don't think will have it. And so I suspect it'll be the more right wing of the party, of those that are coming forward, that will win. It's interesting. Last night on Question Time, I rarely watch Question Time. I watched 10 minutes of it, and then I've had enough because of all the Yahoo stuff. But Naheem Zadawi was on last night, and it's the first time I have heard a Conservative talking about the need for international collaboration to deal with immigration. And it's something I've been talking about for a long time, about the fact that the UN is failing on immigration. We need to enable and challenge the UN to do better, to start dealing with immigration upstream rather than, at the front end, because the whole world is struggling with an immigration problem. But it's the first time I've heard a Conservative drift back into the centre on the immigration issue publicly. And I thought it was, personally, I thought it was really, really refreshing. And I hope we get more of that. I suspect we're going to get less of it. I suspect the party conference, because they're trying to win people over, is going to be about the right of the party talking to the right of the party.
Of the four candidates for the leadership, are there any of those who would appease like One Nation Conservatives like yourselves, or not?
James Cleverly, I think, is the closest for me. I think Robert Jenrick. I think Kemi Badenoch has the potential to. I don't think Kemi Badenoch's right-wing positioning is her true politics. That in itself is a problem for me. But I think she has the potential to. Certainly, absolutely not Robert Jenrick. That's for certain. But my gut instinct, James Cleverly. But a lot of the people the MPs that I respect are supporting Kemi. But I'm just praying and hoping that it's not Robert Jenrick, to be honest, because I think he's awful. He's
a nailed-on favourite at the moment, isn't it?
He is, but he's got no personality. Not only is he very right-wing, he just doesn't have a personality. And I don't. I just don't get it at all.
PMQs is going to be interesting then, if he wins with two leaders who don't have an enormous amount of personality or charisma, do they? As well, it will be.
One's slightly less posh than the other, and that doesn't bother me to a certain extent. It doesn't bother me at all. But that is basically going to be that is going to be PMQs if Robert Jenrick wins. I think the Conservative Party will bomb if he's leader, and the issue I have is that apart from the One Nation voice being drowned out in the Conservative Party at the moment, that's a massive issue. It's bad for the country. It's not just about the Conservative Party. But electorally, if the Labour Party run in 3-4 years' time, there's a danger to me that the Conservative Party will be pushed into third place.
Yeah.
Behind Reform?
No, I think behind the Liberal Democrats. I think Reform will implode. Is a reality in the same way that UKIP did. I think it will be exposed for being what it is. And I think it, and as ever, there'll be some decent people within Reform as members, as there were within UKIP, who became councillors. They'll drift to the Conservatives, and those that are less reasonable will be left with nowhere to go. Again, but that I'm pretty convinced that Reform will implode.
It would be really interesting to see in this next one, the May local elections, because a lot of what, not a lot, but like what Farage was saying on some of the interviews, saying, well, now it's time to build up like our local bases, to invest in organizing at the local level, to like stand candidates in local. So I wonder how much of that is rhetoric and how much of that is actually them investing in some local strategies, and like whether it will impact us in Cambridgeshire or not. I mean, if I was thinking about this as a national picture, I would personally, if I was in their place, invest in those seats where Reform came second in the general, like in terms of if I wanted to have to build up from the general election. But they might have a different strategy. So it'll be interesting to see how many Reform candidates actually do show up in the May elections and where they actually have chances to win any council seats.
Yeah, it's going to be slightly different to before, but I remember when UKIP were at a high. I mean, I was leader of the council. During that particular year when they were really on a high in Cambridgeshire, I think they had 12 councillors, we got a lot done that year, but we got a lot done because we had a cabinet system. Is the truth. And I would fear for a county council without a cabinet system and with a high number of sort of Reform votes is the reality. I'll say this and I'll say it again. The sooner the county council move back to a cabinet system, the better.
So is that because Reform would be disruptive?
Yeah, well, they were very, but we were in no overall control. And
Right.
and what was happening was we managed to get the important stuff. We managed to get through, and I have to say, a lot of that was down to I presume you know him, Alex, but I'm going to mention him because he deserves credit for it. Paul Sales. Paul was for that year, or for some of that year, not all of it. But he was the leader of the Labour group, because it was quite a young group at that time, and quite small as well, to be fair, at that point. But Paul was an absolute voice of reason within the council, and what Paul could see was what mattered, and what didn't, and where he felt it mattered, he sided with us, and where he could, and he was brilliant, actually. And the vote we had on the city deal, I remember that going through council with universal support. But no, they were absolutely, the rhetoric that came from them was difficult, was awful. They were divisive for the sake of being divisive. Everything that's wrong with politics, and that's okay. But if you can manipulate people through a committee system with that sort of thinking, it slows things down. And the committee system is slower anyway, because the cabinet system, the debate and all the decisions are happening by a group of people that have agreed to work together, or a lot of them, not all of them, absolutely. Some of it had to go through council. The only thing that really got in the way during that year, despite all that, actually was the move to the committee system, which a lot of Labour members privately said to me. They were new members and they were whipped into supporting the move to the committee system. A lot of them said to me, during the year, that they regretted committing to it because they realised it was a mistake. But actually, the decision had been made and we couldn't reverse it.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree that the committee system doesn't really work at Cambridgeshire County Council, especially. Well, I mean, it's not very good for backbenchers in either place, I guess. But things move so slowly at County Council, and it doesn't feel like you have any influence over them at all.
I would say this, to be fair. I would say this. Sorry, to back my own point up about. I don't know why we've gone on to this from the Conservative Party conference, but I would say that. I think the evidence bears itself out. There have been changes, to be fair, to the county council, where some of its responsibilities have gone across to the combined authority. But I think I think the evidence since suggests that the reasons I stood down as leader are correct, which is that I didn't think the cabinet system would work, because I can't see the same sense of vision and drive that was coming through the cabinet system now. I think there's some there, and I think some of it is a lot of the vision and drive were about the highways and the strategic highway stuff, and obviously that's not a county council function anymore. But yeah. Anyway,
So-
party conference.
Well, so I think we're done with that. Just to say, we're going, since we're talking about county council, there is a relatively big meeting this week, isn't there? There's a Highways and Transportation Committee special meeting on Thursday about the Mill Lane Road closures and the final decision. It seems like we've had several final decisions on this. I think that decision's been made on Thursday. And I've been asked to sub on that committee, which I'm rather reluctant to do, because it's one of those decisions I don't have any skin in the game for, and it's really difficult to make big decisions on people's lives that I'm not, involved with day to day. So it's going to be hard for me to do that. But
Well, that's precisely the reasoning, because none of us who have been involved either in expressing a view one way or the other because of predetermination, because being such an important decision, actually, you didn't do it people like yourself who aren't involved. Because, for example, like I couldn't be on that because I expressed views in the past, and yeah, so it is a difficult one.
So am I allowed to say what I'm going to say? And be controversial.
No,
This might bump some of your the number of watchers up. From a personal point of view, one of the toughest things to do in politics is make tough decisions, and I think this is one of the times where it needs to happen. Actually, Mill Road is a really special place in Cambridge. It really is a special place. One of the things that gets in the way of it is traffic, and in the way of it becoming an even more special place, and. I actually, in terms of air quality and stuff like that, I would hate to live along there as well. And so from a personal perspective, I think that says everything about where I would go and how I would want to vote on it.
Well, we could on Friday next week review the Highways Committee. I think it's actually very interesting in terms of, I've seen some of the papers being, some of the latest, I don't know how many rounds of consultation there's done on this, but one of the latest rounds being circulated. And again, it seems to me it's one of those cases where people living obviously in the two wards, Petersfield and Romsey, where Mill Road is, that are in favor of closing it to traffic. And then as you go in the nearby wards around Petersfield and Romsey, people are also still broadly in favor, and you have responses from across the county which are broadly against. So I think this, to me, again raises the question about how extensive of an area you should consult on kind of what is a local decision, at the same time while saying, well, it is a road that people use to commute into Cambridge and so on. Although it really depends. Yeah, I mean, it's such a difficult one, because it's okay, to what extent do you consult? Do you consult only in the immediate area, Cambridge City only, or across the county, which then you do get people who are very against?
But one of the things I would say, one of the things about politics, I see this in planning as well, by the way, but which is, if in doubt, go out and consult again. And it's a tool for politicians sometimes not to make decisions, and it happens actually in planning, where you see members at planning committee knowing that they've got to vote in favour of something because of the weight of the officer evidence and the evidence that's in front of them, but with a huge lobby of people that are telling them not to vote in favour of it, and what they do is they defer, and what's coming later most of the time, which is the deferral just leads to them having to make the inevitable decision, but make it 2 or 3 months later. And that sort of stuff we can't do. Politicians are there to make decisions, and sometimes it is about weighing the evidence and weighing evidence up against and not necessarily the weight of numbers, but the weight of evidence on the other side. And it's the weight of evidence that's important, not the numbers. But this is a point where the Mill Road thing, where somebody's got to make a decision, and next week is the time when they can't push it out again.
Well, I genuinely haven't made my mind up on that. That's not just me kind of talking against predetermination. I mean, I haven't read the papers yet, but I need but I will be. I'll be in that meeting. I'm looking forward to making. That's the reason why we're councillors, isn't it? To make difficult decisions. Easy decisions make themselves, and there's enough head nodding where we just box tick on easy decisions almost all of the time. So being involved in these generally difficult ones, like the C2C busway, which I quite enjoyed, despite the fact it was difficult. It's one of the reasons why I want to be a councillor.
And that's why you're a community leader. You're there to lead.
Yeah,
I mean, this is one of the things. Sorry, going back to Labour conference, this is one of the things that came up about exactly at the Blue Labour event about how hard it is. So it was actually in the context of judicial review and the sort of judicialization of the planning system, that it's actually quite difficult to make a decision sometimes because of the layers of sort of the planning is a sort of quasi judicial thing. You can't, you know what I mean? You can't vote against something because you think it's a bad idea. Now,
well, enough people do.
You can.
You shouldn't. You should be voting.
Yeah.
But this thing, I think, and but then it will go to a planning appeal, and I think partly it's a lack of understanding about the system. But it does feel like there are layers and layers and layers, which taken together mean nothing happens. And that, I mean, I don't want to be sort of being populist about it, but I think there is sometimes a benefit of just getting stuff done. You know, with Mill Road, I don't actually know the details about Mill Road. I'm not sure I know where Mill Road is.
Cambridge.
Sorry?
Cambridge.
You heard of it, David?
Cambridge.
It's got universities. Yeah.
Is that near St Neots?
That's a Stephen response.
The pain would probably have been less if a decision had just been made.
Yeah,
I agree.
Yeah, and it could have been made a long time ago, but that's exactly
at the very start of the county council, wasn't it? This was up in the first few months of the county council, because I remember Jerry Bird, who was vice chair of the committee, voting against the whip or against the way she was expected to vote, which was in the very early days of the joint administration. That was a big issue. So people, and Derek Giles was still there, and he's long since departed. So it was it's these are difficult decisions, and people will be watching.
But I think that it was one of the things is to worry about, you know, there's lots of different things, but there is always the worry about judicial review as well, and the cost involved in that. And it just feels there are so many things set up to make so that it's always easier to punt rather than make a decision.
I know, I agree. Quite interesting. I talk about this thing about leadership, not fellowship. You know, about what's needed in politics. And I've actually heard Tony Blair use exactly the same phrase or very similar phrase, but the words leadership, the word fellowship, which I thought I invented, but never mind. I stole it from me.
I've just had a look. Mill Road is where the new mosque is.
Yeah.
Oh,
Okay, I do.
Lovely road with all the restaurants, which I really recommended.
Yeah, no, okay, I do know. I do know where it is. Yes.
So I think we've got our topic for next week. Then we can talk about the fallout of that decision.
Yes.
Yeah, and which way I voted. So I think, should we call it a day there? Thank you very much for watching us, and we'll be back next week. Same time, same place, different topic.
See you next week.
See you later.
Bye.
Cheers all.
Bye.